Session 7 of the second conference, second seminar on moral and political contractualism. Our first talk this afternoon will be by Johannes Servan from the University of Bergen in Norway. The title of his paper is Impartiality and Sympathy. There will be a paper right after that by Professor Fabrício Pontin from the Brazilian Center for Research and Democracy at the Catholic University in Porto Alegre. The title of his paper is Equality and Freedom on the Market, Why We Can't Have Our Cake and Choose It Too. So that's the two papers for this session, and then there'll be questions after each speaker. Johannes? Thanks, Youpa.
I don't know how to pronounce this title in Portuguese, but the English title is Impartiality and Empathy. And what I'm basically doing is trying to show you a part of my dissertation. And for this section in the dissertation, my main question is, how do we critically assess the political thought experiment's ability to ensure impartial judgment about justice? Just let water get ready with the PowerPoint. Yeah. So, I think we need to situate this historically. One of the ways we could do it is to see how the conception of rights has moved pretty fast from a notion of citizen rights related to national constitutions over to a notion of human rights related to international law. So my sort of main point is that the modern thought experiments of the social contract and also the original positional roles reflects this in the sense that they still are designed to deal with the citizen rights and not human rights, strictly speaking. So just to give you a very, of course, oversimplified historical sketch, but these 3 points from the traditional concept of right, which is related to the Latin notion of use, and the question of what is right, over to the more modern question, which is more related to the British notion of rights, which is not what is right, what is the right thing to do, but more the notion of having rights as an individual. And also then, what kind of rights do I have as a citizen? And since the 70s, this is of course a matter of question, but one way to look at it is that since the 70s, this has also become increasingly a question of international law, in the sense that you don't only ask what kind of rights do I have as a citizen, but also what kind of rights do I have as a human being. So what I suggest is that you can talk about the philosophical jet lag, in the sense that universal human rights, in a sense, adequately reflect the contemporary globalized economic structure. But how do we reform our understanding of citizen rights to make them more compatible with this new situation? So basically I'm suggesting that there's a conflict between these. So in this article, which I've worked on in relation to this conference, there's been 2 main questions. The first is, how can we understand the peculiar modern way of understanding and answering the question of impartiality? And I think a lot of the talks that's been the last few days has answered that question, or discussed that question in a very interesting manner. What I'll be focusing on is, how can impartiality be understood basically not only as avoiding personal bias, as you can see in, for instance, in roles, but also cultural bias. as related to national traditions and regional understanding. So in this presentation I will mainly focus on the last question, and I guess that's the last slide. So following Sen's argument in the idea of justice, I think we can say that it boils down to two different definitions of impartiality. One that is closed, which defines impartiality as the ability to avoid personal bias by taking a more neutral, decentralized, and detached position within a certain group, which corresponds pretty good to the question of citizen rights. And one more open definition where impartiality is defined as the ability to transgress an interpersonally invariant but still positional objectivity by including the relevance of views from elsewhere, which I think corresponds better to the notion of human rights. The second definition is closely linked to Smith's device called the impartial spectator, which Sen promotes as a valuable source of critical reflection and as a procedural guarantee against parochialism, or more specifically the jet lag that the traditional political philosophy suffers from. So one way to put the problem of the philosophical jet lag is to talk about a specific kind of parochialism. And in general, I would say that it is a normative commitment to local or regional values, either explicitly, as we see in nationalism or traditionalism or different kinds of fundamentalism, or more implicitly, or we might say naively, in the sense, as we can see in a more procedural case. So you might have, in the second case, in the more implicit case, an explicit universal or cosmopolitan ambition, but your procedures might still be suffering from insufficiency in terms that you don't apply or you don't offer the guarantees to avoid parochialism. And that's the line that Sen follows in the idea of justice. So, to summarize at least one aspect of Sen's critique against Rawls, you can talk about procedural parochialism, which can be defined as procedures that rely on the confinement of relevant perspectives to those of a particular group. In other words, that they rely on close impartiality of a state or a nation or a people. So since Rawls based his conception on a Kantian framework of universality and insisted on the mere hypothetical and expository function of the social contract, it could be said to avoid some of the most obvious objection to this tradition as they are articulated by contemporary knowledge of social evolution, such as promoted by social anthropology and other social sciences. But there's still something critical, as Sen tries to show, to be said about the presumption that Rawls inherited from this tradition. And I will focus on one aspect in particular, how impartiality is achieved through confinement in the original position to the citizens of a particular sovereign state. In other words, what some would call a close notion of impartiality. To make it clear, Rawls himself saw impartiality as playing an important role in the theory of justice. This is reflected in concepts such as the public framework of thought or a common standpoint. If you loosely define impartiality as the ability to avoid personal bias by taking a more neutral and detached position, it is quite obvious that we will find this criterion in most, if not in all, ethical and political convictions. In political philosophy, we find these criteria attempted to be actualized and enhanced in the procedures of thought experiments. And to my mind, this seems to be a possible general intention behind the setup of the hypothetical situation in which we are supposed to accept the social contract as well. In Rawls' case, this is quite explicitly so in the original position. As Derek Parfit has demonstrated on what matters, we can even read the golden rule as a recipe for the kind of thought experiments that seeks impartiality. The rule, one formulation of the rule, one should treat others as one would like others to treat themselves, can hence be seen as a simple way to appeal to our intuition of what is right and wrong. Referring to an ethical principle of reciprocity, the golden rule reaches an impartial position by perceiving others as if they are like me, or more precisely, as if they share my values and preferences and my view on society. Though we might intuitively think of this reciprocity as a normative proof of a flat egalitarian structure, at least we tend to do that in Norway, it is also compatible with, as most thought experiments are, with other principles, such as those of traditional and hierarchical conceptions of social structures. So, in a historical perspective, you might set it up like this, just to follow the same kind of very simple historical sketch. So, corresponding to the traditional question, you have, you can see the golden rules as a kind of a thought experiment design that fits that kind of questions, or corresponds to that kind of questions. And to the modern question of how we design or articulate citizen rights, the social contract is, especially in the case of the original position, is almost designed to perfection. But the question is if it really is able to answer the more recent question, you might say, of how human beings can have rights in a more open society. So Sen offers the solution of the impartial spectator that Smith develops in his theory of moral sentiments. And I wish there was a question mark behind the last one because I'm not sure if it's, but still, yeah. So it's more a question than a conclusion in the last.
Oh, like having human rights?
No, but the impartial spectator.
Okay.
I'm not sure. That's one solution. It's not, at least not, it's not developed to perfection like the original position, like we said. Yeah. So maybe I should just summarize some of this argument, because I'm basically arguing here that you can see how the golden rule sets up one design, but it meets some insufficiencies, especially in terms of guaranteeing you from treating yourself and others from a more instrumental point of view, like parochial or even economical intentions. So you can see kind of a development of these thought experiments, which is, I do very roughly here, but you might do it more sophisticatedly. At least you can see Kant's formulation of the categorical imperative as an answer to the insufficiencies of the golden rule. And further, you can say also that Rawls' original position develops Kant's categorical imperative further on to be even more sophisticated as a kind of a thought experiment that ensures that you avoid personal biases. So, yeah, the veil of ignorance, for instance, can be seen as a sophisticated version of Kant's first-person perspective thought experiment. Yeah, so as okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Sorry. As Sen explains, in seeing the original position as a device of representation, Rawls attempts to address various types of arbitrariness that may influence our thinking, which are to be subjected to ethical discipline to arrive at an impartial point of view. In this sense, impartiality does not ask us to take the position of the reciprocal other or compare my subjective rules to the moral law, but to take the radical anonymous first-person position. In it, we are supposed to represent a common point of view in a self-interested manner. In pure anonymity, we want to make sure that the hypothetically worst off are not too badly situated, since it might end up being ourselves. The original position can be understood both as a design of a thought experiment and as generating an explicit understanding of the unique and commonly acceptable standpoint from which we can conceive a consistent idea of justice. This is described quite clearly in the initial paragraphs of the theory of justice. So, quotes from theory of justice. One way to look at the idea of the original position is to see it as an expository device as part of the thought experiment, which sums up the meaning of these shared and preferably weak conditions and help us to extract its consequences as fair terms of social cooperation. On the other hand, this conception is also an intuitive notion that suggests its own elaboration, so that led by it, we are drawn to define more clearly the standpoint from which we best interpret moral relations.
Is it part of the read?
I'll do fine.
Okay.
If it's better for you guys. Yeah.
Sorry.
Nice. So, as Rawls makes clear, the condition should not be based on any specific strong doctrine of religion and philosophy, or philosophy. Still, there should be, however, conditions that are objective and reasonable in the sense that they are understandable and acceptable to public reasoning. In contrast to Enlightenment versions of social contract, Rawls is in this case much more sensitive to the integrity of the pre-given social circumstances, such as the grammar of language. As for instance, fairness has a soft foundation which corresponds to what intuitively makes sense. But this reliance on the shared and weak conditions might lead one to ask the question, do the original position have procedural weaknesses similar to the golden rule, as it is more a device for enhancing consistency than for the critical assessment of impartiality, which is what concerns Sen. At the same time, the paragraph quoted also opens the door for revisions. The repetition of this procedure enables us to revise the original position according to the explication of its provisional weaknesses, which is disclosed in the extract the consequences of its ability or disability to stand up to the scrutiny of public reason. That's what reasonable persons are reasonable. The central question then becomes, who are these reasonable persons that represent public reason? Who are the we who share the preferably weak conditions, or you might say the common grammar or the ethos, for a social contract? Rawls' answer to this question points directly to the problem of his notion of objectivity as close to impartiality, leading us to the conclusion of the jet lag problem, also that the jet lag problem also is relevant for the original situation. Yeah, so back to the thought experiment, the science. You can say that the society as a whole is defined in terms of the national state, or what Rawls calls the people of a liberal democracy. And only perspectives of those that are members in these societies are taken into account in the original position. And this seems to be a consistent point in Rawls' theory, as in political liberalism, he says, quote, "I assume that the basic structure is that of a closed society, that is, we are to regard it as self-contained and as having no relations with other societies." It's of course not an empirical claim by Rawls, but it's part of his design of the thought experiment. In many ways, this could be seen as an arbitrary territorial bracketing of the original position, limited by the fact that it's part of the design of the thought experiment. But there's no real normative political justification for it, and in general, Rawls' theory, such as, for instance, the principle of reflective equilibrium, is not incompatible with a more cosmopolitan conviction, might even a cosmopolitan procedure. Neither does the law of the peoples adequately address the problem, since it still relies on the notion of closed impartiality and deals with the relations between closed societies. In this sense, Rawls inherits a constraint from the answer of the thought experiments of the social contract to the question of citizen rights, which I suggested becomes inadequate in answering the question of human rights. In sense argument, this does not take the form of a cosmopolitan vision of a global state, such as in Thomas Pogge and others, but as a demand for a revision of the design of the original position to incorporate a guarantee against procedural parochialism through a more open notion of impartiality. In terms of politics, this implies that Sen is not ready to promote a global citizenship with membership entitlements, but rather that each community of citizens should recognize and adopt the fact that we have developed a global market and a global civil society, and hence recognize the enlightenment relevance of perspectives from outside these communities. Yeah, okay. So one way to talk about the jet lag of the social contract is what Sen calls the tyrannical idea of national states, which can be summarized in 2 points. The first is we receive accessibility and interest as confined to national borders, ignoring the richness and interdependency of cross-border relations. Second, we conceive acceptability as guaranteed by a national public, ignoring the potential of views from elsewhere in broadening our own perspective and the ability to scrutinize our local values and presumptions. In this sense, the prejudice of fixed borders and fixed neighborhoods is in itself something to be overcome by influence from outside perspectives. To put it in Rawls' terms, the view from elsewhere enables us to envision our moral relations from afar in a more radical and informed sense. To defend this presumption, Sen makes an interesting psychologically informed normative argument of the Enlightenment relevance of the view from elsewhere. Sen appeals to the thought experiments found in Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiment, and especially the device of the known as the impartial spectator, which is to be read not in the utilitarian way, but as a situated perspective relying on the ability to empathize with others. the view from elsewhere is not is in this way not is in this way. Sorry. The view from elsewhere is in this way given a central epistemological function, and I see this as a promising way to offer a barricade against Rawls' problem of procedural parochialism. The general idea is expressed elsewhere by Sen in an article on Adam Smith. Yeah, that's the disinterested spectator. It is this limitation of reliance on parochial reasoning, ignoring and neglecting many challenging counter-arguments linked with national traditions and regional understandings, that Adam Smith wanted to resist by using the device of the impartial spectator. In the form of the thought experiment of asking what a particular practice or procedure would look like to a disinterested person from afar or near. So, one way to deal with this normative claim of the relevance of the view from elsewhere is to revise the original position by loosening the demand of ignoring the rest of the world, both in terms of neglected minorities and in terms of ignored strangers. But for Sen, the consequences is even more radical, in the sense that we need to conceive the objective of these kinds of hypothetical situations of social choice as less aiming for a perfect consistency or a perfect consistent conception of justice, to a more comparative and case-by-case approach. In other words, it sacrifices some of the consistency of the thought experiment in order to gain value of practical application. Up to this point, I agree pretty much with Sam, and I see the value of incorporating the view from elsewhere as a way to cope with the question of the jet lag. There is no skyhook solution to this, nevertheless, and I think we need to look closer at our conception of empathy in order to get the grip of the effort which is implied in the normative claim taking the position of the view from elsewhere. I don't think Sen underestimates this, but I don't think he develops it all the way through. And I do not have a concluding answer to this epistemological question, and even if I am sympathetic to the way Sen develops this argument, I think we can develop the notion of empathy even further. But just to give you an impression of how central it is to Sen's argument, we can go to the next quote, which is from Smith. So this is the real spectator, or the real stranger, or at least the one you can expect least sympathy and indulgence from. So it basically illustrates how we are affected in different ways by different people, depending on how close they are to us, and if they are, as the real spectator in this quote, not part of our national or cultural sphere, they seems to have an even stronger impact on us, according to Smith. So this is written in the mode of a psychological description of different face-to-face encounters and how they influence and educate our private passive emotions. Still it seems to rely on the belief that the presence of a stranger, the real spectator, will ensure the distance required to make impartial judgments. How are we to make sense of this, of the limits and constraints that make the transition from one mode of face-to-face encounter to the next? And we could also include here the whole variety of mediated or virtual presence by persons in theater or movies, literature, thought experiments, newspapers, and so on. But just to suggest a way to do it as simple as possible, we can try to see how this works in two steps. One from the solitude to close relations, or familiar relations, and the second from familiar relations to relations with strangers. So the first problem I take to be a bit false, since the being with friends and family is usually the given or the normal. Solitude is rather the exception than the beginning. And getting into solitude, as for instance in the original position, is something that takes a lot of effort, not the other way around. This kind of empathy seems to be part of our nature in the sense that it is deeply embedded in our animal being, for instance as sexual and social creatures. There's no clear limits between the human species and, for instance, the big apes. For instance, you have this recent study of how yawning is contagious by small chimpanzees without parents, for instance, who are brought up by humans. They seem to learn how do you say that? Okay. Well, at least it seems to be like a cross-species contagiousy or something like that. Yeah, it becomes contagious in the age of 4 or 5 years old. So, for 5 years old, the chimpanzees starts yawning when their human parents yawns. So, I think it's a good example of how we have this fundamental, we call it passive dimensional empathy. It's obviously not something very intellectual about it. So the second transition, I think, is more problematic, and the second step here as well, from the close to the stranger, and it involves, I think, a kind of intellectual effort that we make, both in terms of identifying with fellow citizens and with fellow human beings. Restricting this effort to just our fellow citizens is in this case arbitrary, though it makes sense in terms of who we count as committed to the same system of membership, entitlements, and duties. The main point is that it must, in all cases, be actively achieved and desired. It is not a passive dimension, but more and more active dimension of empathy. But this transition is also situated historically within the structure of sort of a second nature of passive emphatic emotions of previous active achievements of empathy, you might say, which is regulated by types or stereotypes that can be seen as an inherited and internalized map of accessible or inaccessible strangers. For instance, how we tend to differ between countrymen and people from foreign countries. This does not rely on geographical distance alone, given the transition from perceiving slaves or women as private property to recognizing them as equal public persons was not easily gained, and is still very much a question of making a continuous effort. So one way to see it as different forms of accessibility. first one was access to authority. No? For instance, how few female public figures can take their position as given. Except from some traditionally accepted positions, they must fight hard to gain the same ethos as equivalent, or same authority as equivalent male equals. They also, you could also see it as an access to basic means of autonomy, and how a lot of people lives under conditions which submit them to a more or less total dependency of small favors of others. And you can also see it as access to public discussions, which is related to, I think, to Sam's point on enlightenment relevance that we see today. Kind of a similar problem in the question of how much influence or relevance the voice of immigrants should have in our closed societies. Last point reflects how hard-gained efforts of achieving recognition for universal citizen rights within a closed society has led to a specific and historically contingent second-nature kind of attitudes which take geographical territories to be one and maybe the regulative principle of accessibility and in this accessibility of strangers. And I think we need to reclaim the original universalist ambition in the cosmopolitan effort to reach out to strangers and design thought experiments in a way that adequately reflects the kind of challenges we are facing. Thanks for listening.
Okay, questions?
Johannes, I was curious about your example with empathy and yawning, because yawning might be something that we're willing to interpret as a physiological reaction. So, say I see a stray dog yawning and I yawn back at it. That doesn't mean that I have a relationship of empathy with the dog, unless you are trying to indeed suggest that there is something fundamentally physiological about our empathy, in the same way that there is something like this response already indicates an opening. Yeah. And then, if you do say that, would you say that there is, just to stay on theme, because we've been arguing about that throughout the last 2 days, but would you say there is a naturalistic element to empathical responses, since we can find them and use them in almost a non-normative way, right? Yawning is certainly not normative. And just since you seem to be saying yes, I would immediately then respond to that using Gertz and the example of winking. Because winking can also be a physiological response, but it can also be inserted within a certain cultural pattern. And we all know the results of misinterpreting a wink. Interpretar mal uma piscadela, right? So just let me interfere that in Portuguese, because it's hard to translate, maybe. Vamos dizer, você está na noitada, né? E você se pergunta, aquela menina piscou para mim ou ela está com um cisto no olho? Então a resposta empática, ela pode ser bem ou mal sucedida na medida que eu estou interpretando algo como uma resposta ou como naturalmente colocado. So my main problem is how do we do? How do we deal with that once gestures are integrated within culture, right? So that's it.
Do we still have? Could you go back to the
girl or the strike?
I think it was the last slide. That one, yeah. So I think you're right in the first stage. My point is that it's not really a problem because it's always already given. If you want to say it's a physiological given, that's fine by me. The yawning case kind of suggests that it's a learning process, even still, because you don't get it from birth, but from the age of 4 or 5 years. So you need to learn to make yawning contagious, which is kind of interesting still. But I think your distinction is still relevant for this one, in the sense that in order to understand if it's the kind of one way or the other, if it's a symbolic or just a natural phenomenon, you need to get to the second stage, which is a more active kind of empathy, where you start interpreting and making inferences and kind of have a reflected relation to what others have, what kind of intentions people have with their behavior. I don't think that's the primary problem, but in order to understand your fellow men as political citizens or political individuals, and also as foreigners or as common human beings, you need that kind of active approach. Sorry for not using a microphone.
Se alguém quiser que traduza também a pergunta, fiquem à vontade, só para, por favor, nossa câmera. I don't know, just a question. Vocês gostariam que a gente traduzisse as perguntas ou tá tranquilo? Okay?
Thank you very much for your talk. I just like to know, what do you think about international assistencialism?
Can you repeat that?
What do you think about international assistencialism? Was that it?
Yes.
Assistencialism?
Yeah.
International.
Yeah, because you mentioned Thomas Paul.
I see, yeah.
Maybe, I don't know.
I think I will try to answer it through Sen, in the sense that I think it's right when if I get the question right, it's related to the question of a global state or a global community in some way. And I don't think Sen denies that completely, but it's a question of how realistic it is, and trying to find solutions which makes us deal with the kind of urgent problems we have in ways that could actually solve at least some of our problems without having to depend on a sort of a political community with membership entitlements on a global scale. So what Sen kind of promotes is more that we try to make the kind of national communities we have more internationally responsible. And I think that's at least a more realistic approach at this point. That might be different on a later level, but yeah. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
Mr. from Wikipedia has a question.
I have two questions, and this question is for some clarifications. The first one is if we can say that the impartial spectator is better than the original position for these relations with stranger, why can we just throw away the original positions for this national thought experiment? If you would throw away, oh no, it has an important, it is important. And the other is, I just want to know, what are the criterion for we incorporate or reject the relations with strangers? Is empathy, if I get your point, or what, or are other cultures. All this kind of behavior is good. Is it has some improvement of all that, and your last slide, the access for authority. So how we manage with other cultures, and okay, this culture is in a better position than mine. I should incorporate that.
So your first question was about should we totally reject the original position, or what would be the consequence of the original position? And my immediate question would be no, of course not. It's part of the deal here is that you shouldn't, for instance, get rid of the national state level. And in some ways, the original position is perfectly designed for that level. So the problem is not in itself that procedure, but I think it's pretty clear that it has its weaknesses and limits. And one way to do that, to deal with that, would be to redesign the original position, which I think is the way Thomas Pogge and others do by saying that why can't we apply this to the global situation and say that we should have make kind of impartial judgments without personal bias, so we could basically be situated anywhere in the world and not just anywhere in our society. And I think there's a lot of good stuff to be said about that, but I don't think the international community is in a position to actually grant that kind of membership entitlement, which comes with that kind of admittance. So that would be my kind of concern there. So to the second question, how should we deal with how should we integrate the insight from that kind of perspectives? It's a delicate matter in a sense, but I think we can at least one way to do it is to I don't think we should incorporate everything from a different culture, but see case by case more how for instance we are treating our women, how we deal with stuff that we find difficult. I didn't listen to Mario yesterday, but I got to talk with him on Tuesday, and it was interesting how we had read the same book, and from my perspective, it had this kind of appeal to how I should, or we in Norway should, take more international concern, and I think also the American perspective would be more like, not only of course, but kind of how should we care more about the way we influence the rest of the world. But his perspective were more like, how can we learn from other countries to organize our own state? We kind of talked about it as a first world and third world perspective. I don't think it's completely right. If you see in the Scandinavian context, we have Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, which are very much used to learn from each other all the time. We kind of adopt policies from our neighboring countries. You might do that as well here, I'm not sure, in Latin America, if you kind of copy policies in Argentina, or I don't know if that's an option, or maybe on a federal level that different states would learn from policies made in other states. So that's part of
We take the bad policies.
the bad policies. Yeah, you learn from other mistakes.
Yeah.
That's one way to do it, right? So there's a lot of potential in it, and it's no principally limits to it, as I see. And also the role of the international press or NGOs, I think should be part of how we understand the public reasoning in the national public and give them a voice.
So, if I get it right, you didn't mention the law of peoples or roles in your text. And I'd like to listen to you about it. What do you think? Because personally, I think it's the weaker book of roles, and it tries to make this transition to the international level. I think it fails, and I'd like to listen.
Yeah, you're not the first person I met that said that. And there's different reasons why I think it's not a best option in dealing with international relations. One of them are the concept of the people is kind of weak. How do we deal with countries like Belgium, for instance, where you have two totally different identities and totally different languages, and how do you call it's not just Belgium, it's an experience a lot of people, a lot of countries have, like, how can you call Canada, for instance, of people. I guess in some ways you can, like in a civic sense, that maybe you can justify it with having some kind of contractual tradition together or something like that. But even if you deal with that question, the notion of closed societies seems to be reproduced on an international level, that you have, it's only relations between nations or between peoples, and you don't get you don't reflect the kind of identities you have across peoples or across nation borders, like religious or intellectual, political even. So that would be my main answer to that.
Any other questions? Right. Let's thank Johannes. Just change the maybe you can change this, Fabrício, because she's got to do like this to ask me to change place too. Did I disappear from the loudspeaker? No. Not used to using the microphones.
Okay, why is it not going though? That's bizarre.
Ah, tem que arrastar, eu acho, Fabrício, não?
So let's keep it on the side.
Agora vai dar a volta.
Isso aí congelado.
Ligou?
Vou ventilar.
If you guys want to follow in English, it's going to be here. So just... Cadê o Walter? Está na lista.
You can start.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next talk is by Professor Fabrício Pontin, and his talk is Equality and Freedom on the Market, Why We Can't Have Our Cake and Choose It Too.
Hi. First of all, I should begin by thanking Walter for all his kindness, goodwill, and patience regarding the organization of this event. It's not easy dealing with philosophers, it's not easy dealing with a lot of them, so it's been fun, and I'm quite happy to be here with Johannes. Haven't had the opportunity to make many friends during graduate school, but I'm glad Johannes was one of them. And this is actually part of an ongoing research that I am working on some principles of political economy and how we can use political economy as a tool to understand social choice better, and also how political philosophy, particularly after Rawls, in a sort of way inadvertently appropriates itself with elements of political economy and uses elements of political economy to pollute and to inform the way in which we understand choice on a political level. My first problem here would be to get the work of Kenneth Farrow, who famously, I think in 62 published his dissertation, which was Social Choice and Individual Values, and it was a head-turner for those of us who are interested in social analysis and choice analysis. The book was extremely important, not only because of his analysis of democracy and the paradoxes within the logical notation within democracy, but also because of what it meant for our understanding of Wilfredo Pareto. And what I do in this little talk is that I want to see if I can generalize the presuppositions taken by Arrow, which are a general presupposition regarding democracy, that says that the main presuppositions in the process of voting, which are, say, we vote to elect the most popular candidate, because in the long run, for not the main candidate or the most voted candidate to be elected. So to put it in Godot's terms, or in the terms of incompleteness, getting to P might take us to non-P. The presuppositions for P take us to non-P, and that would be the analytical definition of a paradox right there. But Walter, you can go on. And just take it twice because there was a glitch there. Just one more. There you go. my first point here is that I want you to understand political economy as a use of language. And when I say the word language here, I want to make it very clear that I understand language as a technology. I understand language as something that we use in order to clarify both our ways of relating to objects in the world and the ways in which we can comprehend and understand these objects better. So language, in the way I see it, is a technology, and more important, an evolutive technology. We tend to utilize it and develop it in time, and we tend to improve it in time, and we tend to make associations that are more or less successful and that we drop. So there is a way in which language evolves. And the way I understand political economy, particularly since Mill, is that political economy arises as a language for values. When I say that political economy is a language for values, I think that Mill is the first one, perhaps, not the first, but the first one to do it in a way that we would identify, and in the debate that we still are having in moral and political philosophy, which is a problem that I think that no one pointed better than Wittgenstein in his lectures about ethics, which is when we use terms to refer about values, we do not know what we mean by those terms. And I think that Mill anticipates this problem in a way, and when he talks about the values and the way in which we develop values or considered moral judgments, he develops it in a way that he organizes it according to principles of political economy, that our values reproduce principles of political economy. In this sense, the logic within political economy gives us a control for the languages of moral. Since we cannot really have a naturalistic or a moral realistic control of the way in which we make moral assertions, we use the language of economy as a control. We use the language of political economy as means to control the invariability and the system of possible assertions within moral language. In that sense, we can finally attest cases in which sentences about value can be the case. Once we establish that the system of political economy regulates our assertions about values, we can also say that within that mode of assertionability, sentences about values might be true or false. They are true or false, and insofar they reproduce the necessity of political economy for our discussions on political philosophy. Please, go on. But before going much further on that, we're going to return to that later, but first I want to talk a little bit more about the way in which political economy refers to preference and equilibrium of choice. So first of all, I want to go back to John Stuart Mill and ask what the hell is a preference? First of all, preference should be understood in terms of rationality, but don't say reason. Here, it is more of a way in which first of all, we prefer one thing over another. So it's true that I prefer lemon to orange and oranges to avocado. Okay? So if I can rank my preferences, for me I already gave a good reason to think that, hey, this guy is being rational. But that's not enough. Just ranking is not enough for me. I have to do something else. I have to maintain consistency. So if I say that I prefer lemon to orange and orange to avocado, it also must be true that I prefer lemon to avocado. I cannot then take one of the elements in that and say that my preferences are no longer transitive. Once I express my hierarchy, if I am being rational, I am sustaining my transitive expressed preferences. But there is also something called the harm principle within Mill. The harm principle, if you wish, is the fator cagaço. Let me try to explain that in a very simple way. Let's say, I really, really bloody love chocolate. Now, in time, it is perfectly possible that I start understanding how my preference for chocolate all the time might have quite disastrous results. I'll be getting fat, I'll be getting diabetes, and I'll be just being quite irrational. In that sense, it's perfectly rational that I prefer not to have chocolate all the time, even though chocolate is my favorite thing in the world, because I am reflecting upon my preferences. It's also totally possible that I will not have chocolate if chocolate amounts for in me killing little children to have chocolate. So if my having chocolate implicates in me killing babies by throwing them against the wall until they are very dead, I might change my mind, or we would hope I would change my mind before I am having chocolate. This would be what Mill calls a decided preference criterion. And if you look at Rawls, these are the considered moral judgments in Rawls. The criteria of the considered moral judgments in Rawls reproduces the same notion of the preferred criteria in Mill. And when Rawls does so, he's subscribing to the language of political economy. It's the principle of reduction of harm as a logical necessity within political economy. One of the first people to take Mill seriously, and this is not, in my view, really taken into account enough by philosophers, was Vilfredo Pareto. Vilfredo Pareto was an Italian economist who fell into disgrace because of his association with fascism. And it is true that some of the principles in political economy as developed by Pareto can help out politicians with fascistic, let's say, intentions. But this is not to say that the whole system is fascistic. Quite the opposite. I think that the main presuppositions within Pareto, as we will see, are principles of welfare economics and not principles of scarcity economics. But what I want to show you is how principles of welfare economics actually might introduce us to a problem within choice. So let's look a little bit further into Pareto. I want to now just focus on that because I give a very, very nice focus. Look at this. Come on. There you go. And so now I want to give you guys some examples of Pareto efficiency in choice. I'll run around some 7 examples. Some of this is quite boring because it relates to game theory, but I hope you guys hang on with me. I promise you guys that there will not be rewards in the end, but at least we get to talk a little bit more about this. Please, Walter. So first of all, I want to talk about principle preference input in value, which is what I just introduced when we were talking about Mill. I just want to continue talking about that for a while, which is the way in which we're going to hang pleasures. So in order to follow political economy models, we first have to accept that people will attribute values to goods. So in that sense, let there be 2 individuals choosing fruits, where 100 means best, 50 means good, and 0 means I fucking hate this shit. So we have actor 1 and actor 2 choosing goods, okay? So we have lemon, oranges, and avocado. Actor 1 really likes lemon, oranges, and really dislikes avocado. Actor 2 really likes avocado, oranges, and really hates lemons. Alright, so far so good. Now, if I ask you guys in a system of availability, so both goods are totally available for both actors, and both actors are choosing, what are they going to choose having the opportunity? A is going to choose lemon, and 2 is going to choose avocado. And all instances where these goods are provided. Voted next. But we have a problem here, and my problem is a question: does Mick Jagger have a point? Evidently, in all cases where 1 and 2 are choosing independently of each other and have all 3 possibilities given to them without any sort of interference, they will independently choose A and C and grant their highest pleasure. That is, they get what they want. This is a max-max scenario. Both of them maximize their pleasures and both of them are quite happy. So for thus, in this sense, just to represent, 1 will prefer A, B, C in this sentence, 2 will prefer C, B, A in this sequence, and the principle offered by Mill of the decided preference criterion is Q, E, D, is demonstrated. But the catch is, this inference is possible if and only if we do not have scarce goods. And this is the really important thing that Pareto did. Pareto shows us that we always have scarce goods. This brings us to a conclusion that Mick Jagger has a point. You can't always get what you want. That is,
if we have two scarce goods for two wanting individuals, and this is a game of one play, so you are only playing once, and the first person that plays cancels the plays to the other guys. This is what we call a zero-sum in some extent. Or in this scenario, it might be a zero-sum. Flip a coin. Who gets to play first? That's going to be the only play we're going to have in this instance, all right? So we are having now a game. First of all, we need to flip a coin. Who gets to play first? We have a very clear best choice in terms of direct preference for both A and B. Thing is, the best possible choice for one and the best possible choice for two fucks up the other guy up. So we are in a situation that my best possible scenario implies in the other guy doesn't getting what he wants. No, not only what he wants, he doesn't even get any preference at all. He gets something he hates. What is the problem with this? Well, if A gets what he wants, B doesn't even get what he needs. If B gets what he needs, the A doesn't get what he needs, and Mick Jagger is sad. Why is Mick Jagger sad, Walter? Because if you try sometimes, you might get what you need. So, if one chooses what one prefers, the other gets in problem. But why should I give a shit? Why should I give two hoops about whether or not I am hurting the other guy? I mean, what is saying here that I should give a hell that Walter is getting avocados when he hates avocados, and I'm getting oranges and I love oranges? I don't care about Walter. I really don't mind. I mean, he's giving me a ride later, but I really don't care. I really want my orange. The main thing is, and the main objectivity, the main problem that Pareto has is that we don't know who's getting to play first next time we flip the coin. That would be the first problem. And the second problem is goods are scarce. So if I keep insisting on my best possible goods, there is a high chance that I will waste it. That it will go to waste, that I won't have it all the time. So what is the difference then between, if you can go back please. What is the difference between the state of 50-50 and the state of 101? The difference is that I only have one preferred good. There is only one thing I prefer the best, unless you are a dog. Everything you offer a dog is his favorite thing in the world. But since we are not dogs, we tend to have one thing only that we really like. But there is a lot of stuff that we find acceptable. So the state of 50-50 is a variable state, whereas the 100 state is a stable state. So the distribution of goods that fit 50 is way easier than the distribution of goods that fit 100. Why? Because if we do a little election here, and I ask for you guys freely to tell me what's your favorite thing in the world, accept the position that lots of us are going to say sex. I don't know that if we're actually going to have two choices being the same. So let's take sex out of the equation, and let's let everybody here, and then, or maybe the sexual positions. I think that it would be very difficult for all of us to prefer the same thing. Actually, I think it would be very difficult for two of us to prefer the same thing. And this brings a problem in the distribution of goods according to 100. It does not, however, bring a problem to the distribution of goods according to 50. Insofar 50 fits a whole bunch of stuff that we find perfectly acceptable. So if I ask you guys what kind of fruits you guys kind of like, that's going to be a very big set of fruits, right? Now, if I ask you guys, what is your favorite fruit? That's going to be one fruit. The distribution of these goods is quite different. And creating an equilibrium of this is quite different. So, we can go back to Mick Jagger being sad, please. All right. The reason why Pareto is going to thus opt for equilibrium is that in an equilibrium position, we have a better chance of getting something we accept. For Pareto, opting for the median, opting for the compromise is a rationality necessity. Is a operational necessity from within political economy. Very well. Now, I just want to, there's a little graph now. I won't waste much time on this. I just want to show you guys that we have a lot of conceivable choices here. The conceivable choices not in the line are choices where one of the guys loses bad, okay? The choices that are within the line are choices that one of the guys might lose more and the other guys might win more, but they are both, yeah, okay, I mean, I can go for that. And then you have the points A, C, and B, which are bliss points, because in those points we have something that we quite like, even though it's not our favorite, and both me and Johannes get something we quite like. But we do have a fourth alternative, please. Okay, I will read this one. So when we saw the previous graph, we also had a scenario in which we have two possible choices. Most of the equilibrium points between F1 and F2, the two actors, will be given in the lower end of the spectrum. Now, observe that two of these available states are desirable for both actors and are hence optimum and maximum points. Other points can be point of equilibrium in economical terms, that is, there is enough of this good to both actors. But the choice of these goods would imply that one of the actors would be worse off than the others in the end of the process. This is the core of what Rawls calls the difference principle. Pareto also conceives of similar scenarios where such distribution of commodities is not feasible. In that case, the efficient point is the point where the least bad favorable set of choices is made available for the biggest number of actors. This is a minimax position. We all get something decent. We don't get the worst possible state. It's decent. This is dubbed in economics a bliss point or a minimax scenario. Finally, a last scenario is given in the plane where all the available goods are terrible or goods are unavailable. So let's think of post-war Germany, post-war Japan, and post-war Vietnam. This would be a mini scenario. Given that a Pareto efficiency is dubbed a principle of economic efficiency, we must have some kind of choice. In the last two scenarios, a Pareto efficiency is impossible because there are no efficable means of distribution. Insofar Rawls is concerned, a minimax position where we both lose, but we both choose how to lose, is actually fair. If you can still choose how badly you are doing, okay, it's still fair because you're still getting to somewhat choose the states in which you're ending. Now, it is totally unfair if we don't get to choose at all. Now, Arrow will adapt this model of efficiency to choice within a democratic system. And Arrow leading questions is to be if we can organize the criteria to which we think democracy through according to some sort of efficient and ordinal system of choice, or if a system of ordinal and efficient choices is contradictory with the main presupposition of a democratic system. And Arrow conclusion ultimately is that no, it's not. It's totally contradictory, but that's a different discussion. Now, please, welcome. Now, what we're going to do now, from this point on, I am already presupposing a Pareto distribution. Why? Because the way I see it, we kind of establish, from the standpoint of political philosophy, that the mode in which we should think choices and preferences through, in terms of possibilities for choices, is best thought through in terms of political economy. And once we adopt this model, it seems to me that the best model of sustainable distribution would be a Pareto model. Within this model, then, we presupposes a model of individual choice that requires transitivity and connectivity in the terms thought by Mill, and a social welfare conditions for choices, in which the choices how choices will be possible within a social level. So now we are no longer treating with Fabrício and Johannes, we're treating with Brazil. We are treating with a mode of distribution of goods that no longer deals with 2 people, but 180 million people. And no longer we are dealing with 2 goods, we are dealing with a set of goods that is quite large. Very well, can we go on? Jesus. My bad. Okay, so transitivity and connectivity. Those would be weak criteria for economic rationality. Or, Mill was right in the first place, Eudufus. Why? Go ahead. So first of all, we have models of hierarchy. These models of hierarchy is a way in which Arrow revisits Mill in order to transform a model of analysis of individual choice onto a model of analysis of social choice. And the organization of Arrow will be that P are social of individual preferences, I is individual indifference, and R is rejection. And these models are rational if and only if they are transitive and connected. We'll see these connections in the next one. So, connectivity. For all possible S, X, Y, X prefers Y, Y prefers, rejects X. And transitivity, if and only if X, Y, Z are cases, then X prefers Z, I prefer Z implies rejections of Z. What this is meaning is basically the oranges example again. This is just the notation of it. Okay? What we're dealing here is just with the notation that says, if I rank that I prefer oranges to lime and lime to avocado, I prefer oranges to avocado. That's all this is saying. And these are all, everything that Arrow is asking of you if you want to be a rational actor. So when we talk about rational choice, for example, from within the parameters of political economy, we are referring to this point. And I think that when Rawls is talking about a rational actor, he's also talking about an actor that is behaving thus. He's talking about an actor that is behaving in this model and that's following this description in which he maintains himself somewhat consistent. Let's go ahead. Now, I want to see how this implies the conditions for social welfare. Let's go. This will be faster, don't worry. I just want to show you guys how individually rational preferences become socially rational preferences. And what are the conditions within we must think this through. So first of all, a social welfare function presupposes, please go ahead too. Sorry, Walter. Next one. So a social welfare function presupposes that given a set of choices, no one will be made to choose a choice one does not prefer. Now this is much easier said than done. As we'll see, as we reach a model in which we need to dispose of goods in a more organized manner, it gets very hard not to imply some kind of imposition. And why? For the same reason that I said before, if I let you guys choose whatever fruit you prefer, we'll not have an election of goods, we'll just have individuals wanting what they want. And then we'll quickly be moving on to a kind of organization of society that will be very much like a dog-eat-dog world, in which I want what I want, you want what you want, whoever gets it first is done. And then I hope to God the next time I get it first again. So what do? Let's continue. We also have a criteria of non-dictatorship. One does not get to say what you want, nor do you get to say what other wants. So I don't get to say how you are going to rank your preferences within a system. No. You get to perhaps have an opinion about it. Of course, nobody is claiming that you will not have opinions or that you will not have, you will not judge people for preferring things you would rather that they do not prefer. Universality means that individuals express preferences, if feasible, socially will be again chosen socially. So, say, if I really like oranges and oranges are available to me socially, I will choose oranges every time I can. If they are not, then I go to my second choice, then my third, then my fourth. The main thing in a system of economic distribution is that I never have to choose my last choice. Independence of relevant alternatives is a bit of a tricky business, it's the next one. This is basically meaning that my getting my favorite thing or my next favorite thing should not be affected by the availability or non-availability of things lower in my spectrum of choices. So changes in the availability of other goods that I do not prefer should not imply in a different set of goods being chosen by me. Next one. Monotonicity is what we call supervenience, which is that the choices that are available on a social level are dependent on whichever choices were available in an individual level and that were chosen on an individual level. So the social level is supervened on the individual, and changes in preference orientation on an individual level must imply changes on availability and policies of availability on a social level. So individuals are not faced with the paradox of choosing something they don't want on a private level, or electing something they don't want as a good or as a value, so that good is available or not socially. And non-imposition is just a variation of the first principle that we dealt, which is that the available seats in social welfare might suffer previous implication according to the criteria of social equilibrium. But I'm not going to get into that. This is more important to elections. Okay. Now, what I want to, and I'm already ending, I want to point towards what I will call a general paradox of choice, which means that you might not be able to have your cake and choose what flavor the cake you're having will be like. So first of all, preference and domain. If we let any set of possible choices be the case without any external imposition for control, then the domain of possible preferences will be out of control. Thus, individuals, if we let individuals have any preferences they want, it's perfectly possible that they will think that they will like things that are so exorbitant, that they are so absurd, that all other preferences will be rendered meaningless. Say, a preferred preference to go to the moon. If 25 people in a month go to the moon, social security is in the gutter. So, this is a typical case in which, if we do not control for the sake of availabilities of goods, and control for just the decent stuff to be available, then we might be in trouble in the long run. Also, groups might organize the expression of preferences in a way that they will render other choices, other possible choices, as less important socially. A good example of this is, think of elections in which, for example, Le Pen in France. What happened when Le Pen was elected to go to the second term in France? There was such a system of possible choices within the first term that it allowed individuals that were not representative of the majority or even the equilibrium stages of choices to control the election and to put the elections in terms that there was a real possibility of someone that was the least favorable scenario for a good part of the population to be elected. And why did that happen? Because we allowed the set of possible preferences to be out of control. There were way too many people running. Though this is an example with elections, I think we have a very contemporary counterexample in the market, which is luxury goods. Now, let's think of luxury goods. How do we sustain equilibrium in a market when we have availability of luxury goods? This is a very, very complicated matter, because if people are getting more Ferraris, chances are that the distribution of wealth in the big scheme is probably being very, very disadvantageous to someone. So if you're being able to spend an enormous amount of money on a Ferrari, we have two choices. We either control your possibility of getting a Ferrari, that is, we make Ferraris unavailable to begin with, or we tax the fuck out of it to compensate. The second option is obviously the Scandinavian option. So if you're gonna have, you're gonna want a luxury like Iden in Scandinavia, you better be damn sure you're paying back all the kind of unfair sets in order for this to control a more distributed set of distribution. All right. Second, social choice renders individual choice meaningless. Why? Because individual choices tend to infinite and might be easily manipulated in diffuse groups. Thus, we will have to control the number of feasible individual preferences which are possible in a social scale. Otherwise, we are in a Pareto nightmare. If we let one get what one wants, pretty soon we'll be in a position where we might not be getting what we need. We'll be in a Hobbesian position here. Next. So, we have the general paradox of choice. And the general paradox of choice is that we cannot choose freely. The only way in which we can choose freely, the only way we can choose politically is given a set of possible states. We do not get to prefer whatever we want to prefer. This takes us back to Pareto. If we understand fairness economically, and this means that we understand as the possibility of some choice being given, we'll have to retain some sort of control over the way people might choose. Otherwise, the system will break apart. So, we have, ladies and gentlemen, what I think is our first paradox, not paradigm, the first paradox of choice, which is in order to have cake, we cannot really choose which cake we're having. We can only hope that the mode of distribution of cake is going to be so that we have at least a kind of cake we kind of like. But we will not always get our preferred cake. And this also, in my view, brings the necessity of recasting, please, a mitigated concept of choice, which is, once we adopt a system of distribution, and here we're going to have to choose on a system based on an equality-like distribution or a freedom-based distribution, we already concede that our possible choices are from start limited. And, by the way, also in a freedom-like system, we have our possible choices limited. Why? Because even though the choices are available in the market, we might not be able to afford them. So let's look at a Walmart-based system of choice. You enter Walmart. You want to buy a lawnmower, it's there. Now, the question is, can you? Now let's look at the system back in Bergen. I mean, I would have to actively look for a store where I would find the lawnmower. So we have kind of a different mode of distribution of goods here. And if we want to test our behavior regarding choices, we also must sustain the necessity of scarcity. So in terms of game theory, or even tests of behavior when we're dealing with rational choice, for example, any system or any test that does not consider scarcity as a permanent thing is going to be problematic in terms of results for moral behavior. I am thinking here of the Iowa gambling task, for example, as proposed by Damasio et al. In a famous article called On Having a Strategy Before Deciding on a Strategy. And Damasio's point is really interesting. But his problem is that the Iowa gambling task that he develops presupposes that one of the set of cards that are in the task is not scarce. Now, we're trying to test economic behavior by allowing people to have a state where scarcity is not the case. That's a problem in and of itself. Why? Because it does not reproduce the mode in which we actually have to deal with choices. And actually have to deal with choices even when we're dealing with values. At least I would claim. Now, choices are always given within a parameter where our choices are guidelines for possible available choices. So we are not, our model of choice and of choice theory cannot be based on a pure definition of choice. Thus, our having cake means we're probably not having our favorite cake at all times. But if we do things right, at least we get to have cake. And if we do it even better, we'll be having the cakes we like more often. But that was it. That was basically my main point. I just wanted to give a general task of a general idea. This is, of course, a work in progress. And that's it. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Fabrício.
questions?
I was just wondering, but I don't know if I'm right, if that you think about it as an answer to the libertarian
Yes.
theory. Is
Yeah, I do.
Because sometimes I think they don't consider scarcity.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're absolutely right, and I think that libertarian models have this problem, which is libertarian models think, okay, but let's let the market self-regulate. The problem with this premise of just letting the market self-regulate is that, first of all, the market never self-regulates, because the market will be composed by contingencies, like luck, for example. So how do we deal with just a question of luck? Natural disasters, the way that natural disasters might change economics, the way that contingency might change economics, the way that war changes economics. So are we going to let the market self-regulate and just hope to God that nothing happens? So these are interesting paradoxes to ask libertarians, because I don't know where they would stand on that. And the other problem is, that's it. That's the core of the whole problem, actually. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that, hey, you're not dealing with a system of total prosperity, right? Even when you are very prosperous. And prosperity has a way of polluting the way we think. So let's get back to the Clinton years and what they call the 6 zeros insanity in the house market. That people were overvaluing their houses because they were so goddamn optimistic about the future, right? So you had that period within in American economics that we just let people have their preferences about the prices of their housing. What happened? The mode of distribution quickly, in 8 years, became unsustainable. Guess what? You don't get to give the price you want. Why? Because from a standpoint of sustainability within economics, it is mathematically impossible to sustain it. It's logically, from a modal point of view, and it's also mathematically impossible to just let it go. And actually, this is what, and this is, I think, very misunderstood, but this is what Pareto calls the invisible hand. The invisible hand in Pareto, and Pareto is the one that dubs the term, is that. The invisible hand is the way in which the market is going, not the market, but economics is going to find a way of fixing some kinds of disparities in the way we are attributing value. Because value is value, right? It's not our preference about that value, at least economically speaking.
Não precisa não. Bom, e se eu não quiser o bolo? Né? E o que acontece na maior parte das vezes é,
às vezes o que é oferecido eu não quero.
Certo. Mas é interessante.
Essa questão, não sei se enfim se cabe, mas enfim, uma questão.
Não, ele cabe.
Porque na verdade sempre está se falando de uma escolha dentro de. Né?
Mas...
E muitas vezes para mim não há escolha, né? O mercado já impõe, já
ótimo.
Tem todas
Perfeito.
essas posições do que.
Uma das questões de você atribuir. Claro. Oi?
The question, could you
so should I answer it in English or in Portuguese?
You can answer in
English?
Yes.
Okay, so just let me translate. What if I don't want cake? What if I don't want cake and yet I get to the market and it's all been kind of sad, so I will want cake, or the available goods are not going to be the ones I actually need, right? Which is also something we experience every day if you are in the States, right? That you get to Walmart and the most visible goods are the goods you shouldn't be having, right? Cool. Yeah. Okay. Great. So I think that you express, first of all, why Pareto thinks that a 100,1 situation is logically worse than a 50-50. Because you see, let's say cake is your worst thing in the world. You really fucking hate cake. Okay, there's no way I can please you with cake. I mean, no, nothing, nada, here. Caviar cake, I hate it, go away. Okay? So it's your, like, you really hate it. Cool. Thing is, if we are on a distribution 50-50, even if someone really likes cake, it's there because it is a 50 for them. Okay? But there will be something available within the set that you want. Because that's why I stress the fact that the 50 is a much larger set than the 100. And it's also a much larger set than a 1. So we can distribute goods in a way that at least you get something decent out of it. Something you like enough. It might not be cake. So you don't like cake, but I do. We are in an exchange economy. I get to have my cake, you get to have whatever you want that is decent for you.
But that's not choice.
No, but that's my point.
Yes.
But that's my point, though. That's my point. Yeah, that's my point. That's my point. Yeah, exactly. That's my point. It's a mitigated choice. It's a mitigated choice. However, it is my contention that if we want to speak of choice on a political level, this is the way we should speaking of it. Because otherwise we will be reproducing a model of choice that has no impact on social reality. The way in which we operate with choice on social reality is always mitigated. It's mitigated by circumstances, it's mitigated by the market, it's mitigated by luck. Right? So and gender. And so on. So in that sense, yeah. But the other thing that I think is interesting, that you bring the question of it's been decided for me, and this is something that I think that we experience more and more, in which you just realize, Jesus, what have I just bought? Why did I buy this? So you have all these experiments made by economics, like, for example, you were with me on the room, Marcus, when someone brought this experiment, and I thought it was amazing, that people would enter, so propaganda companies were actually making agreement with markets to play certain kinds of music during the day. So for example, around 6 o'clock when people are going for bakery, they would play French music. And suddenly people will be with their shopping carts filled with French wine, with bread, and with French cheese. That was an experiment, and it worked every time. So there is ways in which we can condition choice based on previous information. And my contention to this experiment would be, sure, as long as you have had the French idiom before, and you can identify French music. Otherwise, of course, the experiment would be probably dull for you. Because, I mean, I don't know what this thing is playing, and I have no association to make for it. But as far as the guy is making the choices for you is concerned, just a small slice of the consuming public doing it is good enough for them. And you didn't really choose, right? So you have this kind of glitches within the system, but it's also part of a political negotiation that will give us the means for a more equalized system of distribution or a more free system of distribution. And I think that then we have different models in which we organize. And my answer, which is a totally wishy-washy answer, is as a society we must see in which way we're moving, but Marquito.
Quer que eu já fale? Vou tentar falar em inglês.
Por favor. Porque eu tô cansado.
Fabrício. Yes. My question is related with roles. And okay, I understand that you've seen this from economics. And my question is that if sometimes this choice that people have, that, okay, that's your max scenario, you are bringing this to the second principle, okay? But there are some rights that are not negotiated. For example, the first principle in roles, okay? You cannot bargain with that. And maybe sometimes people want something that want to think that what they want is something that the state must give. for them, like the first principle. They want to put his choice in the first principle, you know.
Okay.
I don't know if I...
Yeah, sure, but I think I can give you an answer to that from the standpoint of political economy, actually, because I think that you could actually say that the reflective equilibrium in Rawls, a basic condition for the sustainability and continuity of...
So a basic condition for the sustainability and continuity of the reflective equilibrium, and even for the possibility of the reflective equilibrium, is the first principle, right? So the first principle of justice in that sense acquires economic necessity in Rawls for the sustainability of the system. And again, this is not right because Rawls said it, okay? Sure. But if you want to put it that way, you can go back again to Pareto and see that this is exactly the way it works in Pareto for the sustainability of an average distribution. If you look at the restatement of justice as fairness, when Rawls is looking at models of distribution, he uses the first principles of economics as a way of reinforcing reflective equilibrium. When he does that, he's supporting reflective equilibrium on Pareto and supporting the first principle of justice on Pareto. At least that's my reading. So that's why, for example, I think that Rawls' theory is not freestanding. In that sense, Rawls' theory is not freestanding insofar as to presuppose the language of political economy as a comprehensive doctrine of comprehensive doctrines. So in order to even conceive of reasonable comprehensive doctrines in Rawls, you must first adopt the semantic control of political economy. That's been my, again and again, is the point that I've been, pressing.
Let's thank Fabrício for his talk.
Thank you.